Hi, I'm Jim Kirkhoff with the Norman Studios Silent Film Museum in Jacksonville, Florida, a city once known as the winter film capital of the world. It's my pleasure to welcome you to another virtual event made possible through a collaboration with our friends at the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum in Fremont, California. During this program, we'll explore one of the most important facets of Florida's motion picture heritage, and that has to do with Jacksonville being the place where Oliver Hardy got his start. That's right, Oliver Norval Hardy, half of the classic comedy team of Laurel and Hardy, began his motion picture career in, of all places, Jacksonville, Florida. To help examine Hardy's earliest years as a screen performer, we have several well-known film experts joining us. One of them is Rob Stone, a film historian, curator, author, and publisher. In addition to other books he's written about classic film comedy, Rob has authored one profiling the solo careers of both performers. Appropriately titled Laurel or Hardy, it's now being updated with even more information about their work as individual comedians. Another expert joining us is film historian and preservationist Serge Bromberg, who's been responsible for restoring an incredible number of rare silent films, making them available once again. Among Serge's many DVD and Blu-ray releases is one titled, of all things, Laurel or Hardy. Along with other surviving solo shorts featuring Oliver Hardy are a number of short comedies he made during his formative years in Jacksonville. Our third film historian is none other than Randy Skretvedt, who's one of the foremost authorities about the team of Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. In fact, along with his other work, Randy authored what's considered the definitive book about how they made their films. This amazingly detailed work is titled Laurel and Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies, and is a must-have for any classic comedy enthusiast. To say these three film experts are well-suited to talk about Oliver Hardy's early years in Jacksonville is an understatement. For instance, Rob will explain what brought a young Oliver Hardy to town and how he became part of its then burgeoning motion picture industry. Serge will talk about surviving films Hardy made during that time and the painstaking process of restoring them for modern-day audiences. Randy will then share some one-of-a-kind personal snapshots that Oliver Hardy kept in a scrapbook from his early years in Jacksonville. To start things off, let's talk about how Oliver Hardy found his way to Jacksonville and how he became part of the city's growing film industry. So, Rob, can you explain how he got his start?
Hi. Yeah, Norval Hardy was born in January 1892 in Harlem, Georgia, which is just outside Atlanta. But by 1910, his family had moved to Milledgeville, Georgia, and he had obtained the first name Oliver because his father passed away and he took on his father's name. So he became known as Oliver N. Hardy. And he went to work at the Palace Theater, and he was the projectionist and ticket taker and probably swept out the place at night. And he watched the movies and he figured he could do just as good or better than those guys on the screen. So he kind of had the bug to get into the film industry. So around 1913, he's traveling around Georgia singing in a quartet. And he's at I think it was the Montgomery Theater, and just outside Atlanta. And the piano player at the theater was this woman named Madeline Solsham. And Hardy fell in love, and in November 1913, they got married. So right after that, they found their way down to Jacksonville, Florida, primarily because Madeline got a job as the piano player and orchestra leader at the Hotel Burbage in downtown Jacksonville. And so they were now in what was at the time the second movie capital of America. A lot of film companies down there making films, and Hardy had that desire to get into movies. So he occasionally sang at night at the hotel with his wife, but spent a lot of his time of the day kind of just hanging out around the movie sets. Until one day there came an occasion that they needed a large gentleman to play a part. I would say fat comedian, but fat's not a nice word, so we'll say large. And the result was this film called Outwit Dad, which was released in April of 1914 for the Lubin Film Company. That was Hardy's first foray into filmmaking. Now, Lubin, like a lot of other companies, had come down to make movies in Jacksonville. Well, they had been there for a couple of years. They originally took over the Jacksonville Yacht Club at 750 Riverside Avenue, and that's where they made their movies. And Hardy jumped right in, and for the next year or so, he's making movies with Lubin. Now, somewhere along the line there, early on, he went to the barber shop and got a shave, and the Italian barber, hey, nice the baby, and that kind of stuck, and he became known as Babe Hardy, and he was known as Babe Hardy during his time in Jacksonville, and he was known as Babe Hardy professionally for probably the next 15 years, and Babe was what people called him for the rest of his life in his private life. So Oliver and Ollie were just more or less confined to the Laurel and Hardy period of time.
Only a year or so after Hardy began working at Lubin, the Philadelphia-based company decided to pick up and leave Jacksonville. How did the closing of Lubin's studio affect Babe, and what did he do when that happened, Rob?
In Jacksonville, Lubin made what were called gay-time comedies, which featured a rather tall woman, May Hoadley, who stood about 6 feet tall, and her husband, Arthur D. Hodling, was the director. So both a little nepotism and a little play on their last name. And other people worked for Lubin at that time, Raymond McKee and a couple local girls, Frances and Marguerite Niemoyer. But after about a year of doing these comedies, which they had been doing since probably 1909, they decided to do away with the gay time comedies and upgrade. And so they went out and hired an English comedian named Billy Reeves. And when they did that, they kind of let everybody go. So Hardy ends up in mid-1915 in Jacksonville, Florida, and unemployed. So what to do? Raymond McKee and another gentleman who worked at Lubin by the name of Will Lewis, who was a comedian but had become a director, went up to New York City. And in New York, they found work with the Edison Company and made, Raymond McKee and Will Lewis made a ton of movies with Edison. Hardy made 5 or 6, and then he moved on and freelanced around, working for a number of companies in the New York area. Babe eventually found work at a company called Wizard, which was a company put together by studio executive Louis Burston and comedians Bobby Burns and Walter Stoll. Now, the interesting thing about Burns and Stoll was that they had been at the gay time troupe with Lubin, but had left in late 1913, which in a way actually opened up a door for Babe to come in because they were short players. And so Burns and Stoll leaving Lubin kind of led to Hardy getting a shot. But so Hardy went to work for Wizard, which is where Burns and Stoll were, and actually another guy named Billy Rudge worked there also. And other people like Billy Bletcher and Walter Hyers worked there. Now, except for Hyers, they all ended up moving over to this other company that Burston, Burns, and Stoll formed called Vim Comedies. Why the switch from Wizard to Vim? Who knows? But in those days, companies kind of came and went pretty quick. So with the Vim comedies, they were making them in Bayonne, New Jersey, and having a good old time. But the reason people wanted to get out of New York and go down south to particularly Jacksonville was the weather. And in late 1915, around November, it starts to get not so nice up in New York. And so down to Jacksonville they came. Now, the studio that Lubin had been using was vacant since when they started these Billy Reeves comedies, they went up to New York. So Vim took over the Jacksonville Yacht Company, the Jacksonville Yacht Club that had been Lubin, and they started making more of these pokes and jabs comedies. But eventually they decided to take Hardy and Rudge and put them together in films called Plump and Run. So this was the first time someone figured out we should put Hardy with a slighter guy, a skinny guy, and have a thick and thin kind of comedy team. And that's what Hardy and Rudge was, as Plump and Run. And they made about 35 of these movies. And everything was, going really good. And for the year, they're making all kinds of movies and they're having a good time. And Hardy commented once, many years later, that year, 1916, the year he was full-time in Jacksonville making these Vim comedies, that it was perhaps the happiest year of his life making movies.
Since moving to Jacksonville, I've had a chance to track down locations relating to Babe Hardy's time here, the most important of which has to do with where the Lubin and Vim film studio was located. Here's what the main studio building looked like back in the mid-teens, which was at 750 Riverside Avenue. Knowing that, I figured locating the site would be a piece of cake. All I had to do was get in my car and use my GPS. Well, according to my navigation system, in this photo, I'm standing in front of where the studio once operated on Riverside Avenue. Today, that spot is under a section of the Fuller Warren Bridge, which takes I-95 traffic south over the St. Johns River. Well, you can imagine my surprise when I found out this is not where the studio was located, even though the address is 750 Riverside Avenue. Here's the deal. Soon after getting myself settled in Jacksonville, I was fortunate to get to know a guy by the name of Wayne Wood. Wayne has an amazing knowledge of the city's history. He's written numerous books on the subject, gives fascinating lectures to civic groups around town, and plays a leading role in preserving much of the city's history. Well, to make a long story short, Wayne broke it to me, ever so gently, that sometime in the 1920s, the city reassigned Riverside Avenue street numbers. He even provided me with a detailed map of Jacksonville's Riverside district that was drawn up in 1913. Well, based on this map, it turns out the actual studio site was located several blocks east of what's currently 750 Riverside Avenue. Here are some superimposed photos showing where the main production building and dressing rooms were located in relation to the outdoor stage that was positioned behind it. The third photo shows where a promotional still was taken of Babe and Kate Price. Their car was parked in the middle of Riverside Avenue with the Champlin Mansion behind them. Unfortunately, like many other beautiful homes in that area, it was torn down years ago to make way for an office building. Anyway, let's see what the Lubin and Vim studio property looks like today, keeping in mind this is hallowed ground for Laurel and Hardy enthusiasts. Well, here's that piece of property as it appears now. You can see that it's quite different from how things looked more than a century ago. Okay, enough of that. How about if we get back to Rob Stone so we can hear more about Babe Hardy's early work in Jacksonville? Rob, can you tell us how long Hardy worked at Vim and ultimately what became of the company?
So Hardy ended up working at Vim about a year and a half, from November 1915 until, depends on when you say Vim ended, either very late 1916 or very early 1917. Things had been going good at Vim. They had added Marcel Perez at one point, making Bungles comedies. Why Tweedledum became Bungles, I don't know. He only lasted about 4 movies. Then he moved over to this place called Eagle Film Company. I think that studio still survives. But they also brought in Harry Myers and Rosemary Thebe in to make a bunch of domestic films. And everyone always thought those two were married, but they weren't. They cohabitated without benefit of clergy, as they say, because Harry Myers had a wife and 3 or 4 kids at home in Philadelphia. Anyhow, that aside, they decided to quit making the plump and runts, and they brought in Vitagraph comedian Kate Price to appear with Babe Hardy. Kind of plump and plump, they called him, and Billy Rudge went back to work for Pokes and Jabs. And things were going swimmingly. Everything was good. But the whole situation with Vim was kind of weird. Vim had started out making their films kind of as a subsidiary of the Méliès manufacturing company. They were independent but funded by Méliès, because Méliès had quit making movies themselves in America, Gaston Méliès. But they still had a slot in the General Film Service program that the General Film Company put out. So they had an incentive to still supply movies, and they contracted with Vim to do this. Somewhere April 1916, Méliès went away, and Eastern Film Company came in. And Eastern Film Company was almost a vanity project by a rather rich guy up in Providence, Rhode Island. And they'd been making movies for a couple of years, never released any, but been making movies for a couple of years. Well, they took over Vim at around the same time that Will Lewis, who had been directing the Babe Hardy, Kate Price films, he ends up leaving, and Babe takes over. He's directing his own company. Well, directing his own company, he had a little bit of connection to the payroll ledgers and things like that. And he saw some irregularities between what was going on. And people always blame Louis Burston, but it really wasn't Louis Burston. The shady dealings was probably more Eastern Film Company than it was anything the Vim people were doing. But Eastern locked up the payroll ledgers, wouldn't let anybody look at them. There's a Supreme Court case, Mark Dittenfast, who was an executive with Vim, Mark Dittenfast versus Eastern Film Company, and to this day, it directs what people can and can't do as far as looking at company records. And by the way, if you're on the board of directors, you're supposed to be able to look at the records. Anyhow, that caused much turmoil, and Vim split up. Half the folks, Burns and Stoll, and Mark Dittenfast, and Kate Price and Billy Rutch, they all went down the road and started making Amber Star comedies. They ended up renaming that company, and it was Jackson, Jaxon Comedies. But staying at Vim for a while and making more Babe Hardy films was Babe Hardy, Ethel Burton, who had been Burns and Stoll's main support, and a woman named Florence McLaughlin. They stayed and they kept making these comedies until I think they ran out of money, and so they closed, and Hardy basically went home. Why he didn't look for work with other companies, I think, was because Louis Burston had promised him that Vim would come back. So Babe, late 1916, early 1917, basically just went to the Hotel Burbage and sang for his wife's orchestra until about March 1917. Louis Burston comes back into town with a guy named Billy West. And Billy West was the premier Chaplin imitator, and they started making what they called King Bee comedies over at the Thanhouser studio. And it basically was the Babe Hardy Vim company transplanted over to Thanhouser. They added in director Arvid Gillstrom and Billy West, and King Bee was born. But it really hit its roots at Vim, and primarily with Babe Hardy. It's interesting that even though he was at that point a star comedian and the director of his own company, he chose to take a step back and serve as the primary support for Billy West. And if you watch Billy West comedies, he did not imitate Eric Campbell in every comedy. He wasn't the bad guy in every comedy. In fact, in the last film that they made in Jacksonville, The Villain, Hardy is in drag. He's playing the female lead in the film. But anyways, they made like 5 of these King Bee comedies in Jacksonville, but then they up and went back to New York briefly, though. And then after that, went out to California. And that's how Babe Hardy got out to California. And those King Bee comedies were the last films he made that he made in Jacksonville.
Thanks so much, Rob. One little tidbit of information that's important to share is that during his time in Jacksonville, Babe became a lifelong Freemason. He joined Solomon Lodge number 20, which is still a functioning Masonic lodge here in Jacksonville. In fact, it's still headquartered in the same building as it was when Babe first joined, and it can be found at 25 East 1st Street, just north of downtown Jacksonville. As a matter of fact, in 1948, the Jacksonville Lodge issued Babe this card, making him a lifetime member. Okay, now before moving on, let's screen an early Lubin comedy that Hardy starred in. It's part of Serge Bromberg's Laurel OR Hardy Blu-ray set and is titled Mother's Baby Boy. Made in 1914, this one-reel comedy features exterior scenes shot along Riverside's neighborhood streets. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome back. We'd like to thank Flicker Alley, the Library of Congress, and of course Serge Bromberg for making Mother's Baby Boy available for us to screen. By the way, it was Serge who also accompanied the film. As many of you know, this guy is one of the most highly regarded experts in the field of film preservation, so we're really happy to have him with us. Serge, can you give us some background about how you collaborated with the Library of Congress and other film archives to restore some of the shorts Babe Hardy made during his time in Jacksonville?
Jim, restoring a film is a long process. And actually, it started about 30 years ago when I started focusing on Laurel or Hardy. I mean, their films before the team. And Hardy is very special because his films never arrived in France. You must have noticed my French accent. So Laurel was here. And for Hardy, you could find some of the lesser King B productions, but nothing from Jacksonville. And then when we, about 5 or 6 years ago, started working with the Library of Congress, working on that project, we realized that actually there were a lot of films there, and there were a lot of films in other places that we could all gather, compare, reconstruct, clean up, and at the end of the day, make appear as, let's say, as well as they were in the first days, or as much authentic as possible as we can today. Some of the films have a beginning missing, some of the films have the end missing, there are spots, there are defects, but Babe is back. Jacksonville's days of Babe are back.
Thanks, Serge. Let me ask something else. You've been working on restorations of Laurel and Hardy's silent shorts that were made some 10 years after Hardy left Jacksonville. Is there much of a difference with what's involved in bringing those back to life in comparison to the work you did on Babe's Lubin and Vim shorts?
Well, Jim, you see, the problem is the source material. I would say that the best way to restore a film is to find a print or a negative in very good shape. So there's no need to restore. But of course, it does not happen. You must realize that in those days, prints were produced in 20, 30, 40 copies. And after 40 copies, the lab would have worn out the camera negative, the negative would be junked, and the print would be released and circulate as much as they could, and then would be junked also. There was no need of preservation, no idea that those films would be precious in 50 or 100 years from now. So for most of those films, we have one last remaining copy that was found in an attic, a basement, an old cinema. You never can tell, but never the camera negative. They are all gone. And so restoring films from the Jacksonville period is basically, first of all, finding it, which is why there's so many films that do not survive. And when you have it, sometimes you have two prints. But for example, Hungry Hearts, there are two different prints on this one, but it's very seldom. Otherwise, you take the print that you have, you try to stabilize, remove the spots, remove the lines. There's all kinds of digital and optical processes, which are the same actually as what we would do with a Vim short of 1916 and the Laurel and Hardy short of 1927 or 28. The basics are the same. It's the source material that's very, very different.
Serge, when it comes to surviving comedies that Oliver Hardy made during his time in Jacksonville, are there any in particular that you enjoy watching?
Well, in the Jacksonville films, I like the Candy Trail a lot because it's totally ridiculous. It's like, oh, we have an idea, bad guys, good guys, candies, and it makes no sense. But I like this feeling of, oh, let's make a film. This is the idea I have. Well, it's not so good, but, we have no other, so we'll make a film. So those films that are totally surrealistic, I like. I like Hungry Hearts because that's one of the very few films from Vim that was available at Black Hawk in the 60s and 70s, and I had a 16mm print that was incomplete, and I always thought, oh, well, if only I could find the opening of the film. Well, we have it. It is in the DVD Blu-ray set. So that's a film that I've watched so much that I like it very much, although I must say it's certainly not one of the best. And of course, I like the Serenade. Very funny, very musical, and there's this image of Billy Rouge and Oliver Hardy in the notes, that with their faces out of the paper. I like that image. I don't know why, but that's one of the things that are significant. I mean, good direction. Will Lewis was not a major director, but he certainly had good ideas.
Thanks, Serge. So let's screen another Early Babe Hardy short that's found on the Laurel OR Hardy Blu-ray set. It's titled The Serenade and was a film he made for the Vim Comedy Company. In addition to Serge, we'd like to thank Flicker Alley, Library of Congress, and our friend Andrew Simpson, who accompanies the film. So please sit back and enjoy The Serenade, which was released in 1916. Hi, welcome back. According to Oliver Hardy's widow, Lucille, Babe considered his years in Jacksonville to be some of the happiest in his life. And I think you'll see that reflected in some of the snapshots we're about to see. Snapshots he kept in a scrapbook to preserve his Jacksonville memories. These one-of-a-kind photos came into the possession of film historian Randy Skretvedt, and fortunately, he's willing to share them. So, Randy, can you explain how you became the guardian of these very personal photos from Oliver Hardy's early life?
Well, I've been a Laurel and Hardy fan since I was 5 years old and first saw them on television back in 1964. And when I was 9 years old for Christmas, my mother gave me a copy of Jack McCabe's book, Mr. Laurel and Mr. Hardy. And that's how I first learned about Babe Hardy's career in Jacksonville. There were some photographs from that period of him with Lubin and with Vim. And then, of course, there were the letters from his widow, Lucille, that talked about his work in Jacksonville. So I had a smattering of knowledge about that even as a kid. And then when I was about 16 in 1975, Blackhawk Films, the company in Davenport, Iowa, from whom we all bought our Laurel and Hardy movies in Super 8 or 16 millimeter, they came out with Hungry Hearts and One Too Many, which were two of the Vim comedies that Babe made. So I was finally able to see a couple of them. In the early 70s, I got to know Billy Bletcher and his wife Arlene, both of whom had worked at Vim. And Billy, by the way, gave me a stack of stills from the Vim period, which was wonderful. You know, he just gave them to me when I was 16. So I had those. I always wanted to interview Billy, but he was always kind of just really didn't want to do it. He was very kind to me and very nice, but was just rather reluctant to be interviewed. And, you know, I've had that happen sometimes where people really don't want to talk about all their long gone friends from many, many years ago. It just makes them sad because so many of them are gone. So maybe that's why he didn't want to talk to me. But later on, I did talk to Arlene. Now, when I talked to Arlene, by that time, I had acquired the scrapbook. I was running the Orange County Sons of the Desert tent. Now, this is 1979, so I was about 20 years old. And a gentleman who had come to some of our meetings named Walt Kendall called me up on the phone, and he said, you know how many times Oliver Hardy was married? And I said, well, I know of two. I know of Myrtle, and of course, I know Lucille, his widow. I'm friends with her. He said, no, he was married 3 times. The first wife was Madeline. I said, I don't know of any Madeline. He says, well, I have pictures of her. And I said, really? He says, I'm a friend of Myrtle Hardy's. And he explained that she was in a convalescent home in Garden Grove, California, which is about 10 miles south of where I live in Buena Park. And she didn't want to see anybody, but she did have all of these artifacts from her life with Babe. And she wanted them to go to somebody who would take care of them and who would want them. So, you know, Walt Kendall said, come on down and see what I have. So, of course, I did. Most importantly, he had several photo albums and this scrapbook. And so I went home and I told my folks about it, and this was necessary for history. And God bless them, they gave me the $2,200 I needed to buy all of this stuff, which there were like 500 photographs along with the papers. And, you know, unlike Stan, Babe wrote very few letters. So to have a letter or other things written by him was quite a rarity. So I was very, very grateful to get these things. And so I've been the happy custodian of them ever since 1979. And of course, it was amazing to see all of these things for the first time, because this is really a window onto a major aspect of Babe's career, his years in Jacksonville. There are all these wonderful pictures. I don't know how many there are, probably about 150 of them in this scrapbook. And, you know, my objective having things, whenever I'm blessed to have these things, I don't want to just have them myself. To me, they're no good if they're just sitting in my office. What makes them valuable is to share them with people. And so they've been shared on many projects. You know, this is a wonderful keepsake to have, and I've tried to make use of it as best I can for as many projects as I can. And by the way, you can see all the innards of this book. That's another extra that's on the Definitive Restorations Blu-ray and DVD. I remember that Lucille told me that one reason that Babe loved working at the Hal Roach Studios so much was because it reminded him a lot of the camaraderie that had been with the company at Vim. He said they were a big happy family, and they socialized together as well as making movies. And he said that it was the same atmosphere at Roaches. Everybody got along very, very well with each other. It was a big friend. It wasn't just a job. It was really a community of people who enjoyed their work, making people laugh, and who made each other laugh even when they weren't working together. So you see that in these photographs. A lot of them where they're just at various locations that they used for films. Also, I want to mention Babe's pets. You see pictures of the pets even more than you see pictures of his first wife in these photographs. He had a wonderful little white dog, with curly fur that they called Babe Jr. And in picture after picture after picture, you see Babe cradling this dog, taking him everywhere, took him to the beach and took him on location, probably took him to the studio every day. He's always carrying this little dog, Babe Jr. And through the years, Babe had several dogs, all small dogs. He seemed to like small dogs. He had another small white dog in the late 20s. And Babe and Lucille had a chow dog, which they named Toy. So I have a picture of Babe and Toy from 1948. But anyway, he loved that dog. I've often wondered what happened to Babe Jr. He probably had to leave him behind when he moved to Bayonne, New Jersey, but he certainly was devoted to him. And not only did he have a pet dog named Babe Jr., he had a capuchin monkey named Babe the Third. And there are several photographs in the scrapbook of Babe with the monkey, Babe the Third. And a small monkey, and Babe is shown with him on his shoulder. So Babe had quite a menagerie when he was in Jacksonville.
That's great, Randy. Can you share any behind-the-scenes snapshots of Babe that were taken while he was shooting those early Jacksonville comedies?
Well, along with the photographs that are personal and behind-the-scenes photos, it's always wonderful to have scenes from the films, especially since many of the films don't survive anymore. All we have are stills and reviews in trade papers, so great to have these. And it's interesting that Babe is in drag in several of them. Stan Laurel, for 3 years in vaudeville, was in drag every working day of his life because he was doing a sketch called No Mother to Guide Her, and he played an old biddy in that sketch for 3 years. But Oliver Hardy was no stranger to doing comedies in feminine attire, because there's one called A Maid to Order, another one called A Warm Reception, and one called A Day at School. And in all three of those, he's made up sort of a Margaret Dumont dowager type. You know, he seems to be very dignified. He probably could have worked doing that type of role frequently if he'd wanted to. So there are photographs from those films. There's also one called Prize Winners, where Babe and Billy Rouge, who was his partner in the Plump and Runt team, I guess they're recent escapees from prison. And they're dressed in beards and rags like they're railroad hobos. And Babe seems to have particularly enjoyed that makeup, because there are several photographs of him striking different poses and enjoying that. Then there's one called Human Hounds, which evidently was an espionage story. And in that one, Babe wears a very dignified tuxedo, cutaway coat, and a top hat. And he seems to have liked that outfit too, because there are several photos of him posing with Florence McLaughlin and other people while he's in that attire. Not necessarily scenes from the film, but just, you know, sort of regally carrying himself while he's dressed that way. So, you know, there's all sorts of wonderful little sidelights in addition to actual scenes from the films in here.
Those are wonderful images, Randy. Can you show us some more of Babe's personal photos and explain a bit about them? For instance, he loved going to the beach, in particular Pablo Beach, which is now called Jacksonville Beach. Can you show us any photos of his visits there?
There are several photographs of the Vim company, or in some of them they're identified as the Vimites, Vimites, and evidently they were also called the Vimmies. They had quite a camaraderie for a company that was only around for a little bit over a year. So they formed a bond very quickly. And there's lots of pictures of them at the beach, sometimes with a car. And all the gentlemen are dressed, you know, with full shirts, and rather they're very modestly attired. And certainly the women are. They've got very large billowy swimsuits on. But lots and lots of pictures of them at the beach. So they must have gone there several times. And of course, once again, Babe has got Babe Jr. with him, took the dog to the beach. And you see several of the different performers. There's Harry Myers and Rosemary Thebe, who had their own unit at Vim. Harry Myers, we probably remember most for his work in the Charles Chaplin movie City Lights, where he's the millionaire who sometimes is drunk and sometimes is not. And Rosemary Thebe, I remember mainly from the W.C. Fields short, The Fatal Glass of Beer, where she's Mrs. Snavely. The two of them worked together and eventually got married in 1924. There's also Louis Burston, who is the head of the company, and Billy Bletcher. And once again, he was a little guy. You see him as the chief of police in Babes in Toyland. Billy was also a co-star with Billy Gilbert in a series of comedy musicals at the Hal Roach Studios, and was a very active voice actor. So you get to see him, another guy named Joe Cohen, who was a supporting actor. They're all socializing. And once again, if you get Rob's Pokes and Jabs picture book, you'll get to see all of those, and he identifies all those people. So again, it was not just a job for these people. They were socializing and having a great time with each other.
These are fascinating, Randy, since they show a young, up-and-coming comedian simply having fun. The seaside area that Hardy and his co-workers frequented is at the easternmost end of Beach Boulevard, which is now a busy 6-lane roadway. But back then, it would probably just have been a narrow country lane. I've checked out the area of Beach, and here's what it looks like today. Obviously, this shot of me is a bit more colorful than those old black and white photos from Babe's scrapbook, but not much else has changed. The wide stretch of sand is still there where it meets the Atlantic Ocean. One of the Plump and Runt films that Babe made while at Vim involved he and his partner Billy Rouge taking a trip to Spain. Its title was Never Again and featured the two comics getting into mishaps with a Spanish dancer. Of course, the troupe didn't travel all the way to Spain to shoot a simple one-reel comedy. Instead, they traveled a short distance south from Jacksonville to St. Augustine, where they used the very exotic-looking Hotel Ponce de Leon as a backdrop. Here's a snapshot from the hotel courtyard that's in the Jacksonville scrapbook. The tall woman standing second from the left looks to be Babe dressed in drag, and his partner Billy Rouge appears to be on the far right. Unfortunately, the film is missing, but the location is still there. Here's what it looks like today. You can see that it's virtually unchanged, but today it's part of Flagler College, which took ownership of the hotel in 1968. I'd like to thank Randy for sharing those wonderful photos from Babe's personal scrapbook. They really give a sense of the fun and camaraderie Hardy experienced during his 4 years in Jacksonville as he learned the craft of film comedy. By the way, if you have an interest in having some of these rare photos or similar candid shots of a young Oliver Hardy from other scrapbooks, you can find them in the Pokes and Jabs picture book compiled by Rob Stone. It's published by Split Reel in conjunction with Rob's Pokes and Jabs book, which offers a complete history of the short-lived Vim comedy company. Speaking of Rob Stone, I'd like to thank him, along with our friend Serge Bromberg, and of course Randy Skretvedt, for sharing their extensive knowledge of Oliver Hardy's formative years in Jacksonville, Florida. Oh, by the way, although the Lubin and Vim studio disappeared with time, just as other film studios did throughout the city, one still stands. Constructed by the Eagle Film Company in 1915 and later becoming home to producer Richard Norman in the 1920s, this 5-building complex looks much as it did when Babe Hardy worked in Jacksonville's motion picture industry. Today, it houses the Norman Studios Silent Film Museum, which is dedicated to celebrating and preserving Jacksonville's motion picture legacy, just as the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum in Fremont, California, is committed to sustaining that region's film heritage. The association between our two museums is extremely special. Think about it. In 1915, the Chicago-based Eagle Film Company built a state-of-the-art studio in Jacksonville, Florida, for the purpose of making comedy shorts. At that very same time, Charlie Chaplin moved from SNA's Chicago studio to the company's production facility in Niles, California, which is now a district of Fremont. And it was there he created some classic screen comedy as he developed and refined his tramp character. Both of our museums are incredibly unique and very much in need of your support. So please take time to go to the two websites on your screen and find out more about how you can help. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Early Filmmaking in Jacksonville, Florida. Take care.